Sometimes after women have children, they have a look. We all know that look, where you know you done messed up. It's a look that will wrap around you and hold you accountable for whatever mischief you found yourself perpetuating. Mothers out there, you know you have. Jörmungandr. Jörmungandr stands among Hel and Fenrir as one of the feared children of Loki, and as such, he's one of the more controversial deities for heathens to worship. But he also has a little place on my altar. And those who find out are often curious as to why I have an altar that holds both Thor and Jörmungandr. So let's dive into this deity. Who is Jörmungandr? Why is he so controversial? And what might the justification be to place him on your altar? The big reason why this might be considered controversial is that the legends around Jörmungandr heavily suggest a broader rivalry between Jörmungandr and Thor. In fact, many of the stories that include Jörmungandr also include Thor. So let's discuss a few of them. The first myth of Jörmungandr is the story of his birth as an offspring of Loki and Angrboda. This parentage contributes to a negative view of the Midgard serpent, as he is the offspring of the chaotic Loki and the bringer of sorrow. Snorri writes that due to this parentage, great evil was expected of Jörmungandr and his siblings. Because of foreboding prophecies, which are not described, associated with the three children of Loki and Angrboda, they are brought to Odin, who makes decisions regarding each of their fate. Jörmungandr is decided first, and he is tossed into the ocean. Jörmungandr swims into the ocean depths and wraps around the world, biting his own tail. Hel is assigned to the land of the dead, and Fenrir is kept in Asgard until his grim fate comes to bear. Whether or not the reasoning for this myth is authentic to the beliefs of ancient heathens is unknown. Angrboda seems to have been a later construction whose name may have never even come up among the Vikings. Stories around Loki seem to have been significantly affected by Christianity by the time they were written down, giving us an obscured view around how he may have been seen. This puts into question two things: whether or not Jörmungandr is the son of Angrboda or Loki, and whether or not he was viewed as evil. Now, a little about my perspective. My personal approach to spirituality has been one that looks a little more closely at deities that are considered evil by direct interpretation of the myths. This inspires me to investigate them a little more. And I think I've been consistent with this considering my videos on Hel, Fenrir, and Nidhogg, as well as Ran and Eir. I feel that Jörmungandr is no exception here. The issue of his parentage, like with Hel and Fenrir, doesn't really work well as evidence to the case against Jörmungandr. And let's talk a little about why. Part of this has to do with the villainizing of Loki, who seems to have inherited traits of Satan and devils in Icelandic storytelling, despite other stories of his companionship with Thor and his place among the Aesir. One of these traits is horrifying offspring as evidence to his own evil nature. This myth seems rooted mainly in Christian tradition of fallen angels found in the Book of Enoch as well as the Book of Genesis. In both cases, fallen angels reproduce with humanity and their offspring are seen as monsters. Loki seems to have inherited this belief, which does not seem to have been authentic to Norse tradition, but instead a Christian import. Beyond that, the conception of evil being passed down from generation to generation is unreasonable on its face, even if we assume an evil Loki for a minute. I imagine that some of y'all watching this video have shitty parents and yet are not shitty people, so this idea of Jörmungandr being evil because of his origin as Loki's son is riddled with problems. The remainder of the Jörmungandr myths highlight his rivalry with Thor. The first of these, and what Snorri seems to allude to as being the origin of the rivalry for some reason, is the appearance of Jörmungandr in the court of Utgarda Loki. The Jotun of Illusion disguises the Midgard serpent as a gray cat and challenges Thor to lift it up. So he's like, "Behold, lift up this tiny cat." And the little kitty walks in and goes, yeah, I'm not a snake, meow. And Thor places his hand under the belly of the cat and only manages to make it lift a single paw off of the ground. Utgarda Loki later explains that he was terrified by this because one paw leaving the ground demonstrated Thor's immense strength. The thing to learn from this myth is that all cats have a non-zero chance of being Jörmungandr. Thor, it is later revealed, remains salty about, in his own view, failing to lift Jörmungandr in the court of Utgarda Loki. Snorri carries this story into the second myth of Thor's rivalry with Jörmungandr, which is the story of Thor going fishing for the snake. Thor, disguised as a child, convinces the Jotun Heimir to row him out into dangerous waters, bringing an ox head with him as bait. And when he pulls Jörmungandr out of the water, torrential waves flow over the boat and Heimir is frightened. So he cuts the line and Jörmungandr sinks back into the ocean. Snorri continues on to describe alternate endings to this myth, the first of which involves Thor throwing his hammer and killing Jörmungandr by beheading him. But Snorri contests this myth, saying that it's wrong. He insists that Jörmungandr was only injured and lives on in the depths of the ocean encircling the world. He states that instead, Thor knocked Heimir out of the boat in disgust for ruining his catch, and then waded ashore on his own. I tell you what, this story tracks. If you go fishing with a redneck and you cut his line on a massive fish just as he's pulling it in, you ain't staying in that boat for much longer. The Poetic Edda describes another version of this myth, in which the fishing for Jörmungandr is a side quest, while Thor and Tyr go looking for a cauldron for Ægir that is big enough to handle the sheer amount of ale that he wants to brew for the gods. Their adventure in the Poetic Edda raises some questions, including whether or not Loki was the original companion rather than Tyr. The way the story goes, it could have easily been a part of the journey with Loki to the realm of Utgarda Loki. And this would have raised some further questions about Loki's relationship with Jörmungandr. The text, unfortunately, is missing a line where we learn whether or not Jörmungandr survives. We only learn that he sinks back into the ocean. It is from this story that it's often concluded that at least one version of the Thor and Jörmungandr myth is represented as one of eternal struggle between Jörmungandr and Thor. An eternal struggle certainly makes sense with Thor's protective nature towards humanity and Jörmungandr's possible challenge to that protective nature. Violent storms at sea that threaten ships may be a dark answer to Thor's power, rooted instead in Jörmungandr. Just as there are multiple war gods within Norse myth, it's reasonable to suggest that there are multiple storm gods. Jörmungandr, Freyr, and Ægir may all fill this kind of role as storm gods. And you know what? I love storms, and all of these deities are on my altar, so I've got a altar full of stormy boys. Before we get to the final reference, Snorri's Edda compiles several poetic references to Jörmungandr, particularly among references to Thor. Several incredible kennings for both Thor and Jörmungandr are recorded in these various sections. Among the kennings for the Midgard serpent are the shining snake, necklace of the earth, coiling eel, ugly ring, poison gleaming serpent, and several more. Most of these references either casually reference the rivalry between Thor and Jörmungandr, or they are from various poetic tellings of the story of Thor fishing for Jörmungandr. One of these stories comes from Ulf Uggason's Husdrapa, a poem of which we only have a few fragments. Ulf attends a wedding that is held by a local chieftain named Olaf Höskuldsson, and Ulf presents his poem as a gift, in which he describes elaborate wooden carvings in Olaf's fire hall. He stands and recites the poem at the wedding feast, and is well rewarded for his descriptions. Among the carvings were 3 stories: Baldur's funeral, Loki in battle with Heimdall, and Thor in battle with Jörmungandr. The only hints of this poem that we have are preserved in Snorri's Edda. Interestingly, Snorri preserved verses that disagree with him, as Ulf presents a version of the story which depicts the death of Jörmungandr, to which Snorri objects. The likely truth of the matter here is that there was variation in the legend. In Ulf's telling, Jörmungandr dies, but perhaps he presented his version to impress his host by changing the story and providing imagery of Thor decapitating his rival. Perhaps there were competing traditions. Perhaps this is an earlier tradition. Or even perhaps Jörmungandr revives each time Thor defeats him. History, it seems, has seen fit to hide the answers from us. But, it could have been as simple as this. Ulf sits down after his telling and then says to everyone, Yeah, that's right. Jormy the Stormy Wormy did himself a squirmy and then Thor killed him. What now? What now? I'm a skald and fuck you, that's what. One way to explain this discrepancy in a way that is favorable to Jörmungandr is the nature of skaldic poetry in Norse tradition. In this case, it was a performance for a host. The poem itself was a gift from a guest, and it therefore might contain some exaggerations. Thor was in heavy popular worship in Iceland. Many names in Icelandic culture start with Thor, such as Thorvald or Thorstein. It's easy to imagine that a reframing of the myth in a way that is favorable to Thor might be seen as an honorable gift. Snorri might have preserved part of this poem for its beauty and poetic value, since he is writing a handbook on poetics. But as he writes his details of the myth, he sees fit to point out that this is not actually how the myth ends. Something that convinces me that this is a more active myth is that this is one of the most commonly referenced stories in Norse visual culture. There are several carvings of what seem to be Thor fighting or fishing for Jörmungandr. And to me, this suggests that this is depicting an active myth, something of a current struggle that was relevant to their lives. This, along with Snorri's correction, convinces me that the rumors of Jörmungandr's death were greatly exaggerated. Finally, we have the story of Jörmungandr at Ragnarok. The references to Jörmungandr within this legend are fairly short. Snorri discusses the massive waves as the Midgard serpent arrives on land, suggesting that he may have been associated with tsunamis or storms at sea. He roars into the sky and spreads poison throughout the atmosphere and the sea. In the final battle with the gods, Jörmungandr will face off with Thor, and Thor will be victorious against the world serpent. But after this victory, he will only walk 9 paces before he dies of Jörmungandr's poison. Now, the story of Ragnarok seems to be a late conception that is likely rooted in some elements of myth. But the story that we have seems to be a mishmash of multiple legends. Among them is the story of Jörmungandr's rivalry with Thor. And actually, this would be further evidence that their struggle is an active myth. This story, along with Odin's and perhaps Tyr's rivalry with Fenrir, and Loki's rivalry with Heimdall, all come to a head in a way that seems to be a Christian imitation of Revelation using Norse trappings. It seems to be true that these rivalries existed, but it's probably not the case that they were thought of in exactly this way. What is more likely the case to me is that these deities have rivalries in one way or another, but that their rivalries sustained a greater order of some kind. In my video on Fenrir, I discussed this balance between Fenrir and Tyr, essentially between law and rebellion. And the same justification can be applied to Jörmungandr. And interestingly, the Völuspá has a little nugget that may give us a hint. Maybe it's a typo, maybe it's nothing, but there is a weird little kenning that might offer some insight. This line in the Völuspá is controversial as to how it is to be interpreted. When describing Thor striking the Midgard serpent, it seems that Thor is described as striking in wrath against the protector of Midgard. Now, this is strange because the main deity associated with protecting Midgard is Thor, but here, Oxford professor Caroline Larrington suggests that it is instead used as a kenning for Jörmungandr. Other translations of the Poetic Edda, however, propose that it is more likely referencing Thor. This is certainly an interesting grammatical controversy, but it brings out a curious idea, one that I think provides a more nuanced interpretation of the myth. Perhaps both protect Midgard, but in different ways. Thor, famously, is the protector of mankind and the gods against Jotun and various other forces. Perhaps Jörmungandr is a dark reflection, the protector of everything else, of nature itself. And thus, we have an eternal struggle, or at least one that will last along with humanity. Now, going forward, this becomes a question of reconstruction versus revival. A reconstruction of the myth would be taking the ancient attitude in a way that is straightforward. A revival of the myth is going to be taking it into a more modern context in light of a historical view. Often in heathenry, what is framed as reconstruction is actually a revival because blanks are being filled in with modern tradition. This is the case with all heathen ritual, for example. In the case of the Midgard serpent, it's unclear if Jörmungandr was considered a protector of nature, but viewing him as a balance of Thor, given their rivalry, can certainly be justified in a historical view. There seem to be a host of characters in Norse myth who have rivalries with the gods that become targets for villainization, especially after Christianization. Hel, the goddess of death, is a prime example here. She exists in the same myth, assigning evil to Jörmungandr and herself due to their parentage. She has, even in recent history, been assigned as an evil presence, as a demon in the Christian hell, with power comparable to Satan himself. And yet, it seems, she is simply a caretaker of the dead. Many of the Jotun, giants, Ettin, and other similar entities are presences primarily associated with nature. Jorth, for example, is associated with the earth. Jorth, interestingly enough, is the mother of Thor and is yet considered a Jotun and encircled by Jörmungandr. Little things like this cause me to consider that there are more shades of gray in Norse myth than a direct reading of the myths may lead us to believe. Many of these entities have been given assignments of evil. Surtr would be an obvious example. Ægir and his brothers, Kari and Logi, represent natural forces and are labeled as Jotun, and vary with respect to how evil they might be. Jotun are commonly associated with forests, wind, the ocean, volcanoes. Humanity's struggle with nature may have informed the association of these entities with evil, and further, Christianization probably exaggerated this association. But it's also worth noting that the meaning behind these myths have changed over time based on how we look at them. For example, there is a heavy focus on the lens of chaos versus order in scholarship around Norse myth, and sometimes that focus gets overstated, resulting in oversimplified visions of these ancient myths. And I think that it's reasonable to say that Thor has associations with order, and it could be reasonable to associate Jörmungandr with chaos, but I think it's a mistake to view these as the simple summary of their motivations. Thor likely has an association with humanity's struggle against nature, and it's here where Jörmungandr can be seen as his reflection. Typically, this struggle is examined within the context of chaos versus order, but I think it's best to relax that conception's grip on our interpretation and examine these stories in terms of character, action, and motivation. Thor struggles against the Jotun, but seems to have a primary struggle against Jormungandr, who wraps around Midgard. Jormungandr's typical stance encircling Midgard can easily be seen in a protective light. So here we see a battle between two protectors. So instead of a summary of chaos versus order and aggressor versus defender, it's protector versus protector and defender versus defender with a border that's constantly in flux, and neither can win. Thor, unbalanced, would slay everything that threatens humanity, but Jörmungandr stands as a check against him, protecting from Thor that which he would destroy if he were to overstep. At times, humanity goes too far in our struggle against nature, and sometimes nature responds, sometimes violently. If Jörmungandr wins, humanity's protection is gone, and nature may just destroy us. If Thor wins, nature is destroyed as humanity runs unchecked. We pollute and exploit the world until it has nothing left to give. Nature, of course, sustains us, and without it, we would die as Jörmungandr releases his poison in his last breath. The end of their struggle, in either case, means the end of humanity, and it is therefore up to us to take care of the environment, to acknowledge the struggle between us and our environment, and approach our surroundings with care. I view both as worthy of our respect, our offering, and our thanks. And so for this reason, Jörmungandr has a place on my altar. Thor is the protector of Midgard, but Jörmungandr is also the protector of Midgard. Both of them protect that which is important to me, and so they're both invited as guests. Now, I would imagine they don't arrive at the same time, but who knows? Let me know your thoughts. Do you view Jörmungandr in the same way, or is your image of him a little different? As shown in this video, there's a few ways to look at this legend, and the myths that we have remain unclear. Perhaps this interpretation is completely off, and Jörmungandr is simply Thor's defeated foe. The challenge is that the texts are unclear, so a coherent myth cannot easily be pulled out of history. But this is the value of looking at a reconstruction of an idea under the lens of revivalism. Perhaps, in reviving the myth and looking at it with our new perspectives, we can give greater understanding to an ancient story. To me, this process is completely reasonable and justifiable within a heathen practice. Now, I've seen one take that Jörmungandr is a lying snake that tricks people into worshipping him for reasons. Through this, they'll accuse people of harmful worship or something along those lines. This, and takes like it, don't seem to be based on any historical evidence, and seem to be just whining about people worshipping deities they don't like. But further, to me, this is just doing the same thing to Jörmungandr that's often done to Fenrir, Loki, and Hel, importing Christian myths and conceptions of good and evil, in this case from Genesis, and hiding them in places they likely never existed. This is the narrative that Christians would apply to all our gods during Christianization. They would say, Odin exists, but he's just a demon. Some Christians repeat this even today, and it's honestly embarrassing to see it among other heathens. This kind of thing is just latent Christianity, but in a different form. Perhaps this is done because it's convenient to a broader misinterpretation of the religion. Perhaps because it feels good to look down on others. Perhaps because they don't know any better. But either way, it doesn't justify the whining. Is my view the same view that was held by Vikings of the past? Probably not. It's likely true that they held Jörmungandr in a negative light. They may have held that Jörmungandr was the protector of Midgard in the context of the earth itself, but they probably wouldn't have had an interpretation of Thor's victory being a possible negative. For them, nature had the upper hand. They were concerned about getting lost at sea at nature's whims. For them, a victory for Thor would have meant a pacified natural world. Their environmental existential threats were different from ours. For us, we have the capacity to end our own existence through various ways of changing or even destroying our own environment. This experience might offer a new perspective on an old struggle. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Be sure to like this vid if you enjoyed it, and the subscribe button and the like button are locked in an eternal struggle, but I don't think I want either of them to win. Go ahead and click both of them to be safe. Be sure to ring the bell for more heathen content, and remember to find a way or make one. You must respect the dangerous of noodles.